of clemency regarding Roger Jason Stone. That is a big one. I mean, Roger Stone has been a big part of the legal conversation around the former president. Leather-bound box of documents, various classified documents, potential presidential record, binder of photos, handwritten note, box labeled A1212. Here are some generic, I think, items. Miscellaneous secret documents, miscellaneous top secret documents, other boxes with other labels, more miscellaneous top secret documents, confidential documents. And I believe I had read something about
here is the list. Let's hold
France.
it up. I mean, the thing is, you can see the list. We just printed it out if you want to show here. I don't know if you can zoom in. It really doesn't tell you much, though. I mean, it's a list of boxes.
Except for those words.
Except for those words, top secret.
Documents.
There's nothing super specific here, right? Miscellaneous top secret documents, miscellaneous secret. I mean, binder of photos, handwritten note, but there are no details, right? So it does sort of raise as many questions as it, purports to answer.
But I'm also curious, the former president said, these are not classified. He said that if the Department of Justice wanted the documents, that they could have asked for them. And he also said something that I found interesting. He said it was sealed in a storage with an additional lock as per their request. Who is their request? Is he, talking about the National Archives? And did someone actually know that, the former president was in possession of these documents and were okay with him having them at Mar-a-Lago, or is that just untrue?
I mean, we're reading through the warrant as we speak. We're literally looking at it in real time. And of course, it does to me look like what we were talking about earlier. The affidavit is really what's going to show the reasoning behind all of this.
Do we still have Scott?
Which we don't.
Scott McFarlane. Okay, Scott, I'm very curious about the information on the warrant that says information regarding or related to the president of France and executive grant of clemency about Roger Stone. Why would that be? Tell me the relevance of this Roger Stone document. Would that be something that needed to be in the possession of the National Archives? If so, why? What did that make you think of?
Let me say emphatically, I've read a lot of search warrants, hundreds of them, especially with the January 6 cases. This search warrant is unlike anything I've ever seen. First of all, the scope and size of Mar-a-Lago, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, and the judge authorized the FBI to search any space that would have been accessible to what they call the POTUS, the former president of the United States, including storage areas, including what they characterize as the 45 office, which would be the office of the 45th president. The search warrant was signed August 5th. That's a week ago today during the lunch hour. And it empowered the federal agents to go in anytime between August 5th at the lunch hour and next Friday, August 19th. And we all know this search warrant was executed on Monday because the former president said as much. And the search warrant indicates the Trump defense team signed its acknowledgement that it had a copy of that inventory on Monday at about 6 p.m. when word started circulating soon thereafter. The Roger Stone item is first on the list in the inventory, and it stands out as such a strong contrast to everything else because everything else is categorized broadly, or nearly everything else is. We'll report into why the Roger Stone documentation would be included, but here's what we can say for certain. 11 of the 28 or 29 listed items have a characterization of secret or classified or confidential. That's between 1/3 and 1/2. Probably not an insignificant number, but at least we can see what proportion of the materials are considered secret or classified. But we've seen search warrants over the years of federal agents empowered to search an apartment, to search a closet, a cubicle, a phone, a property, but never seen an authorization to search a complex that has 58 bedrooms and 33 bathrooms. Probably gives us an indication of the scope and size or the potential broadness of what they had to do Monday at Mar-a-Lago.
And could there be overlapping investigations that the Department of Justice is looking into? I mean, the reason why Roger Stone's name jumped out is because I know that you've been covering the January 6 extensively. And so I'm just wondering, is there anything other than the possible violation of the Presidential Records Act that the DOJ is there for?
It's a very provocative question. I think the Roger Stone item in the inventory makes it a very important question. But this is why we are so desirous to see the affidavit, the paperwork that gave launch to this search warrant. And often when we look through criminal case files, when we study federal cases, the first place we go to get a sense of the case is the affidavit. The affidavit is usually a very plain-spoken, blunt, sometimes illustrative argument as to why the prosecutors want a judge to give them access to somebody's private, confidential property. It's usually a pretty forthright argument. That's not something the Department of Justice announced yesterday it was going to make a motion to unseal. It's not something they asked the court to unseal, nor have they asked President Trump to accept the unsealing of this affidavit. So that mystery remains, but that would answer a lot of these questions. And really, it's the mother lode of this paperwork so far would be the affidavit for the search warrant.
Right, but Scott, I just do want to point out in attachment B of the warrant, it lists the property to be seized, correct? And item C says any government and or presidential records created between January 20th, 2017 and January 20th, 2021. So that's pretty much anything. Yeah, that's pretty much anything. I mean, that's a pretty wide, swath of records. And then D, item D says any evidence of the knowing alteration, destruction, or concealment of any government and or presidential records or of any documents with classification markings. I mean, that's obviously we'd heard some reporting that perhaps the president had destroyed some documents, had a pattern of
flushing documents.
So, I mean, this is a pretty, I guess I'm a little surprised by that. Do you want to comment on how, that sounds like a pretty wide range of documents to be able to seize.
It's the scope of his presidency.
Yeah, any government and or presidential records created during his entire presidency, essentially, that might be there at Mar-a-Lago.
With the acknowledgement, this case is a unicorn. It's one of a kind. There's been nothing like it before. With that acknowledgement, that's pretty traditional for search warrants. You try to paint as broad a brush stroke as you can. Widen those parameters or widen those goalposts so that if you are given authorization to search, you've got more latitude to look. That raises the bar. It makes it more difficult sometimes to get the approval of the judge if you paint with a wide brush or have those goalposts far apart. But it's the inclination of federal investigators and federal prosecutors to try to ask for everything that they can get. And that's somewhat boilerplate, that January 2017 through January 2021, that is the entire Trump presidency.
Right.
So if you're looking for presidential records, I'll note this. Some of this investigation was foreshadowed. We know the National Archives in January of this year asked or noticed and notified that there were potentially records that were supposed to be in its possession that weren't, that were potentially at Mar-a-Lago. We know 6 months ago this week, the National Archives asked the U.S. Justice Department to conduct an investigation. It's half a year later, the Justice Department, through its FBI agents, is on site at Mar-a-Lago. So some of this was forecast, but where this has turned, where we have a search warrant unsealed from federal court, where it lists 11 categories or 11 items categorized as secret or confidential, that may be a turn nobody expected.
And Scott, one of the things that, in his response, because former President Trump, true to form, responded and blamed or asked, what about former President Obama? The National Archives, because I know that this is going to be out there, has denied the claims that former President Obama had in some way or form also kept some presidential records. That has, the National Archives came out and said basically that is not true.
That they're in possession of all of those classified records,
and
right.
The ones that were in Chicago are within a National Archives building. Does that say something to you about what we can expect from former President Trump's responses to all of this being put out there, as you say, in a very exceptional manner into the public, in the face of the public, by the Department of Justice?
Past his prologue, yeah, that's what we can expect. But what struck me more, Lilia, is that the responsiveness, the nimbleness of the response from the National Archives, very quickly, in a matter of hours, knocking down that baseless allegation about former President Obama. The U.S. Department of Justice, the Attorney General, having a news conference to talk about an ongoing investigation. It's not unprecedented, but it's exceedingly rare. I'm struck this week by how federal agencies are quite quickly putting out messages that in any other context, at any other time, they would remain silent on. Maybe that's an indication of where this is headed.
Just really quickly, Scott, before we turn to Jessica Levinson, who's also standing by, some of the items are rather interesting. We already mentioned the grant of clemency to Roger Stone, but information regarding the president of France was also in the items that were taken from Mar-a-Lago, including these binders of photos. Do we have any insight into why that might have been of interest to investigators?
Well, let me give you an unsatisfying answer that we have put inquiries in to the French government and the French embassy to try to find out answers to that.
It might just be the totality of the boxes. Is that would that make sense? Is just this is a totality of the boxes that the National Archives has asked, and these are the items that we're missing from there? Does that make sense?
I don't want to guesstimate on that, but I can tell you certainly those are the two things that don't look like the others. Everything else is broadly categorized as an envelope or a box or a category. Those are two specific things that are granularly described. And that's where we're starting our inquiries this afternoon.
All right. Well, Jessica, let's turn to you now. Knowing what we now know, which granted, there's still a lot that we don't know, does it look like charges could be filed in this situation? And if they are, potentially, how would you ever find a jury that was not biased?
Two great questions. So in terms of could charges ever be brought, I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I have two very different feelings happening at once, which is if you looked at what is happening, if you look at the evidence, if you look at the search warrant, and it wasn't the former president's residence, it was, Jane Smith's residence, you would say, I really think charges are forthcoming because let's remember what's happened. A law enforcement officer has sworn under oath that there is probable cause of evidence of a crime. And we now know what those crimes were. We're talking about espionage. We're talking about obstruction of justice. We're talking about concealing government documents. And then independently, a magistrate judge said, you're right, there's enough there. And so just historically, if we looked at that, would it be more likely than not that that person at whom their residence then had those documents and had power previously over those documents, that they would then face charges? I think the answer is yes. But on the other hand, we have seen this former president in hot water before, and we have seen that there's been no significant legal exposure. Now, it could be that this is the turning point. It could be that it changes here. And, in that case, we really need to just wait to see. I mean, you had this great conversation with Scott. The real document with all of the information, obviously, is the affidavit we just talked about that allows you to get the search warrant in the first place. I don't know if that will be unsealed because at this point, we're talking about documents that may be in that have national security concerns. Right. And maybe we cannot unseal them, or we can unseal them, but it would be heavily redacted.
Right, because this feels rather unsatisfying, right? This warrant doesn't really tell us that much.
Which is to be expected.
Which is to be expected.
Just the warrant and the receipts.
Right.
I mean, when it comes to the affidavit, though, we've all heard so many times, it's an ongoing investigation here. It's kind of a precedent that's been broken, having the Department of Justice, the Attorney General of the United States, come forward and say, yes, this is going on, signing the warrant and then asking for it to be all unsealed. When it comes to the affidavit, do you expect or suspect that this is what the Department of Justice is going to hold on to as the FBI continues their investigation in order not to jeopardize the investigation to the degree that it may have already when it's in the public?
Well, that's the question, right? So one is, do they not want this unsealed because there are still ongoing investigations? And clearly this investigation is still ongoing. And two, what about national security concerns? I'm now realizing, of course, that you asked me about how to pick a jury for a case like this. And what I would say is when it comes to jury selection, you're allowed to have your own personal views. The question is when you walk into that room, can you put your views aside to the extent that you can look at the facts that are presented to you? You can look at the applicable law and you can make a decision. Every judge has political views. Every juror has political views. And every person has a bias, a slant. We don't ask people to decide not to be humans when they become jurors. Now, of course, in this case, is it supercharged? And the answer is yes. Jury selection would be enormously important in this type of case, frankly, like it is in so many criminal cases. But it is important. What we're looking for is people not who have never heard of the president or who don't have any preconceived views, but who can fairly apply the law to the facts. And I do have enough faith. I do think that's possible.
I mean, before getting to a jury, I mean, just a grand jury, how long would it take for something like this? And I know that we haven't even heard what charges may be filed, but what do you suspect we should, be looking towards in the days to come? What's next?
So I'm going to give you another unsatisfying answer, which is we're not at the beginning. And other than that, I'm not sure we know for sure exactly where we are. And why do I say we're not at the beginning? Because you and I are talking about this, right? Because the Department of Justice, the FBI knew that this was going to get a lot of publicity and that it would fundamentally have to alter the investigation in some way with all of this attention on it. So this is not the first step. And as we talked about before, I think that there was a process where the Department of Justice was asking for this information and some was provided. And then there was something where there was a breakdown, right? The information stopped coming. And I think the Department of Justice understood that that information, as we've been discussing, is very important. I do want to underscore again, that just this issue of declassifying information, I don't think that ends the legal inquiry here. Mm-hmm. And I will say what happens next, something I think changed in the last 7 days to indicate to the Department of Justice, the evidence is where we think it is. The evidence is really important and it raises national security concerns, and we have to go in and get it now because there have been discussions for a long time trying to get this information. So what happens next? I have a feeling we're going to go into a little bit of a blackout period again, a little bit of deja vu from the Mueller investigation for some people. And we will potentially not hear for a while. What's a while? We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we clearly, I think you're right when it comes to this investigation. But I just want to pivot really quickly to Scott McFarland, who's still standing by, because, Scott, there are obviously multiple investigations going on right now. You've been closely following the January 6th Commission and those investigations. How do you think this particular investigation can influence that one and the other ones that are going into not just, the former president's, actions on and around January 6th, but also his business dealings in New York, his company's dealings? How can these cases all influence each other?
Yeah, there are several ongoing investigations with a nexus to former President Trump. And multiple sources have told CBS News, and the search warrant indicates this is about presidential records. Records that the archives believes were supposed to be in the archives' possession, but that were at Mar-a-Lago. And that's what yielded or triggered this search. But it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening during a multi-front legal war for former President Trump. There's that civil case in New York City about his business dealings, the civil case for which he sat for a deposition Wednesday and invoked his Fifth Amendment rights hundreds of times. There's a criminal investigation in Manhattan involving the former president. There's that Georgia investigation, which is perhaps moving the most quickly, about the attempt to overturn the Georgia 2020 election results, being headquartered and operated out of Fulton County, Georgia, in Atlanta. Then there's the Washington, D.C. investigations into the U.S. Capitol attack and the U.S. Capitol insurrection, which, oh, by the way, is the largest criminal investigation in U.S. history and the largest criminal prosecution ever by the U.S. Justice Department. We've gone through every one of the 860-plus cases so far, and we can say with clarity, former President Trump isn't named as a defendant or a co-conspirator or an accomplice in any of those cases. But that investigation most certainly has yielded fruit. People who are accused of conspiracy, plotting, and planning the attack, and those people have been on the radar of the January 6th Select Committee, which is very much looking into former President Trump. So there's all these threads out there, which raises the stakes for any search of the former president's property. Raises the stakes, and because nobody can rule out or tell us what the end point is of the investigation in Mar-a-Lago. But that said, there are any number of sources who've told CBS News this was triggered by concern about the Presidential Records Act, the maintaining of records. But I'll add one aside. had a conversation with one of the defense attorneys for the accused Oath Keeper seditious conspirators, the group accused of plotting attack on January 6th. And those defendants are considering, if not likely, to ask for a delay of their September criminal trial. And they'll argue that the Mar-a-Lago search, the news that has been triggered by all of this movement this week, could inflame and bias the jury. And they'll want a continuation of their case. And I bet they're not the last ones to ask for that.
That's on their case, Scott, but I'm just curious. I mean, yesterday and throughout this week, we have been covering the search, and the president and his team's discourse around it has been, this is a witch hunt, as he usually says. Now we know there were, in fact, documents that were retrieved, that there's a conversation about whether they were classified. There was a subpoena. It doesn't seem to have been followed. I mean, knowing what you know, talking and covering so closely the cases from January 6th, but also the way that information and disinformation is spread. I mean, where do you see this going, given what we know? How can this be manipulated in a way that, you know, the president's team, the former president's team, can get that base rattled up and continue saying that there's no there, when clearly there is plenty there?
Well, I mean, just to follow up on Lilia's comment there, Scott, maybe what are you hearing there on Capitol Hill from lawmakers? I mean, that were very critical yesterday of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice and the FBI. What sort of response are you hearing today as we get more information?
And the former president has already galvanized opposition to this search and to the FBI. And we heard it in so many words from a group of House Republicans this morning, after some reporting had already come out about what was possibly in those boxes and in that office. We had House Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee have a news conference here, criticize the FBI, say the FBI is prone to overreaching, that they target President Trump disproportionately. They're already making the argument on his behalf. That's elected leaders, and the former president likely could continue to galvanize them to support him. But how about the broader public? If you look at January 6th, if you look at the fallout from the Capitol riot and the investigation, the former president has been able to galvanize some members of his base, some large number of Americans, to deny the truth or the scope and size of the U.S. Capitol attack. We've heard his own supporters in court, those accused of crimes, deny the violence of January 6th. We've heard some of his own supporters call it a peaceful tourist visit or a legitimate political protest. Then you have the former president himself flirting with the idea of offering pardons for all the January 6th defendants if he were to take office again after a future election, therefore minimizing what we all saw on television. An undeniable fact. You've seen the video of police being accosted, assaulted, and injured. We know several people died. Several police officers committed suicide in the days and weeks after that response. It's undeniable to the eyes and ears what happened January 6th, but he's still been able to galvanize his supporters to deny the scope of that. No reason to believe that wouldn't happen in this case, too, no matter what happens next after the release of this search warrant.
Just to recap a little bit of the concerns after we've seen this warrant, I want to bring in Jessica Levinson back. Jessica, just legally speaking, you were talking about some of the more, serious concerns when it comes to potential crimes, including Espionage Act. Can you walk us through how you're reading all of that from the warrant that we now have in our hands and the receipt of what was taken from Mar-a-Lago?
Sure. I think the most straightforward thing to say is, as a result of unsealing the search warrant, we now know that there was probable cause to look into the Espionage Act and obstruction of justice. And that's a big deal. So we've been talking today about how much we don't know. That actually is a lot to find out, again, that a law enforcement officer swore under oath and that a magistrate judge signed off on a search warrant that indicated that there's probable cause, meaning it's more likely than not, to believe that the Espionage Act was violated and obstruction of justice. There's another statute in there that mentions basically mistreating government documents. There's 3 different statutes that are referenced as I understand it. And so we know this is about more than just, imagine you're an average person, you leave your job, and you take the stapler and a paperweight. This is about a lot more than that. When you work at a private company, your work product typically belongs to them. The same is true for the president. His work, his papers belongs to the people. In this case, those papers, what we're seeing here, there's evidence that those are very, very important papers to the tune of potentially threatening our national security.
I mean, and when you're looking at the warrant, I'm just curious about when it comes to the Espionage Act, how did we arrive there? Just as a recap for people watching, I have the warrant in front of me. In terms of the violations of potential violations of the Espionage Act and obstruction of justice, if you can kind of walk us through how we arrived there, just for our audience that's joining us right now. We have the search warrant that led to the search at Mar-a-Lago. We have the list of documents that were retrieved. Some of those were labeled top secret documents, confidential documents. If you can tell us about how you arrived at those very serious potential charges.
Potential charges, exactly. So when it comes to the Espionage Act, we're looking at gathering, transmitting, or losing information that's related to the national defense. There's another statute here that's cited. That relates to the destruction, alteration, or falsification of records involved in federal investigations. That would be where we're looking really at obstruction of justice. And then finally, there's a statute here that relates to the concealment or mutilation or removal of government documents. So that really defines for us, I think, the terms of the game of what, in fact, the Department of Justice was looking at. And hopefully that helps people understand why the documents here are important and are things that we don't want to be housed at a private residence, but really need to be stored at the National Archives where they can be protected and where there are processes for people, if they can and if they have the clearance, to be able to see those documents.
Jessica, I have a question because we did hear reporting earlier that there were some documents potentially that may have had something to do with the nuclear program or something nuclear related. I mean, obviously from this particular warrant that's been unsealed, we don't know what's in some of these boxes. We don't know what's in some of these top secret boxes. But where, you know, obviously without speculating too much, where would information like that come? Of course, it hasn't been confirmed by CBS News reporting, but there have been some other outlets who've reported that. We don't see it in the warrant. So would that have come from sources inside the administration?
Sources inside the administration or people at Mar-a-Lago who have access to the documents and or have seen those documents. And as you said, there's been that reporting. We don't know if that involves nuclear weapons that belong to the United States, that might belong to other countries. Again, lots of unanswered questions. But yes, it could either be somebody who maybe helped pack up these documents, who saw what was in the documents, or somebody on the receiving end, somebody who's at Mar-a-Lago right now. And that, frankly, could have been what kind of started the clock on saying, we need to get the search warrant, we need to get it now. Again, the reporting is that this was basically a no-knock search warrant, so there wasn't it means there wasn't warning. And what does that mean? It means that there was the understanding that they shouldn't give warning because maybe evidence would be removed or harmed or destroyed. And again, that's the reporting that we're seeing here. And I think that's why there's a good indication that somebody tipped law enforcement to what was in these documents.
I just want to point out, Jessica, that somebody at the National Archives and Records Administration is on top of this. They're on top of whatever is going on, you know, moment to moment, because earlier, the former president tweeted out on Truth Social that, you know, all of this stuff they could have had at any time they wanted, he said. He says, what are they going to do with the 33 million pages of documents, many of which are classified, that the President Obama took to Chicago? And, you know, in no short order, the National Archives and Records Administration responded. Yeah. You know, no grass is growing under their feet, saying, as required by the PRA, former President Obama has no control over where and how the NARA stores presidential records of his administration. So
they're saying they had the records all along from the moment that former President Obama left office. That, yes, some records went to Chicago, but to
that they're in control of all of it.
A National Archives building, and that's where they're being held. And they're saying that they're not classified documents either way. So they're instantly contradicting those claims, which, we know throughout the entire presidency, throughout the entire 2016 campaign, and today there's always what about Obama?
We have to take you to a CBS News special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Nancy Cordes in the nation's capital. A federal judge has unsealed the warrant that authorized the unprecedented search of former President Donald Trump's Florida home, Mar-a-Lago. The document reveals that the FBI is investigating Mr. Trump for potential violations of the Espionage Act. They also recovered documents that were labeled top secret during the search. CBS's Robert Costa and Catherine Herridge are here with more details. Bob, I'll start with you. What does this search warrant tell us? What doesn't it tell us?
I've been reviewing the search warrant and the related documents with Catherine and our colleagues here at CBS News. As you said, the FBI searched the former president's home earlier this week in Florida, and they found 4 sets of top secret documents. And there's one set of documents that has been marked TS-SCI, TS meaning top secret, and SCI meaning sensitive compartmented information, highly classified material, part of an ongoing federal investigation of how the former president handled materials he brought from the White House to his Florida estate.
And in those boxes, they found things like photos, information about the president of France. What does this, give us a glimpse into what the president actually may have had there at Mar-a-Lago?
What we've learned from this warrant that has been unsealed, the former president did not contest it being unsealed by a federal judge today, is pretty limited. But we do know that the intent of this investigation is about looking into how he handled documents, and the Espionage Act, which you mentioned, is very important because it's illegal to gather or transmit or lose important national security documents, defense information, and there's a concern from the investigative side that the former president in some way was cavalier with these documents once he left the White House, but we're not learning an enormous amount of information. In other words, we're learning the search warrant, which is in a sense, the outline of what the FBI did to go into Mar-a-Lago, but we haven't seen the affidavit, the underlying foundational evidence that ultimately led to a subpoena and then an FBI search.
That would tell us a lot more. But Catherine, give us a sense of what we now know about the potential crimes that the FBI may be investigating.
Well, Nancy, I think this is really a window into the potential criminal violations that President Trump is facing. There's one which is USC 793, and that's the gathering and the loss of national defense information. So think about things like Navy vessels, weapon systems, satellite networks. That would be the kind of thing that they're talking about. The second is 18 USC 2071, which is the concealment, removal, and mutilation of records. So on its face, that's a violation of this Presidential Records Act, where every president has to preserve the records for the National Archives. And then the last one is 18 USC 1519, and this is essentially a falsification or an obstruction charge. So those are the 3. We've got these 2 sort of national security information charges or violations. One is the Espionage Act, and then the last is basically a boilerplate obstruction charge.
So pretty serious charges.
Absolutely.
And now that we've seen the search warrant, what everyone wants to see, you brought it up, Robert, is the affidavit itself, which would give us a lot more information. How likely are we to see that affidavit when we're in the middle of an investigation? I know the fact that this search warrant has been unsealed is pretty unusual.
In the 20 years that I've worked in this area, covering FBI and the Justice Department, I've never seen a case like this. It's highly unusual to unseal a search warrant, and to take it a step further, it would be even more unusual to see the affidavit made public. But I say that because a number of media organizations, including CBS News, is seeking the unsealing of that affidavit. And the affidavit is sort of a fancy term, but it's basically a sworn statement from an agent saying, this is the evidence that we gathered, which gave us probable cause, judge, to execute a search warrant on a former president's residence.
Bob, we've gotten a statement from a spokesman for President Trump. It says, in part, the raid of President President Trump's home was not just unprecedented, but unnecessary. And now they are leaking lies and innuendos to try to explain away the weaponization of government against their dominant political opponent, essentially accusing the FBI of being some sort of handmaiden of President Trump's political opponents.
There has been a collapse in the relationship between the Trump legal team and the Trump political advisors and the Justice Department during this investigation. The chronology here is important to remember. It was back in the spring that it became clear that there was an ongoing investigation into the former president's handling of documents. There was a grand jury that issued a subpoena for more information. Then in June, there was a somewhat pleasant exchange at Mar-a-Lago between federal investigators and the president's lawyers. But between June, that meeting, and the August FBI search, the question is what happened? What triggered the FBI search? I just sat down with former National Security Advisor John Bolton here in Washington, to be sure, a Trump critic, but he said it suggests possibly that something of high national security concern that could have been in these documents was of note to the investigators. Because if something's down in Mar-a-Lago where a former president is living and it's top secret or sensitive compartmented information, the Justice Department, we're told by sources, could be concerned about foreign intelligence maybe having access to the property, or that information that the former president brought down just somehow not being secure. You keep seeing the former president referencing in his statements that he has put locks on that material down in Florida.
And Catherine, President Trump has been saying on social media that, hey, if the FBI had wanted these documents, they could have just asked me and I would have handed them over. But the timeline that Bob just laid out suggests that they tried that avenue and didn't get all the documents that they wanted.
Some of those who are close to the former president believe that there's been a misrepresentation about a breakdown in the communication, that from their point of view, they felt that things were going along pretty well and that there was a good, healthy dialogue. But that's going to be litigated in the court here. The other big issue is going to be this issue of classification. The President of the United States is the ultimate declassification authority. So they have the authority, if they work through the proper channels, they can't just wave a wand and declassify information, whether those steps were taken here for every one of the documents. So you're going to need to put your reading glasses on and get real familiar with SAP and SCI and top secret. I mean, this is the kind of discussion it's going to come down to, and intent. That will be very important.
Just to build on that, such an important point, Catherine. Was this FBI search something prompted, and we still don't know this, by their concern of criminal intent by the former president to somehow misuse or abuse his power as a former president and take these documents? Or was it because of concern of some national security issue or vulnerability? For the Attorney General to speak out this week on an ongoing investigation, highly unusual, almost historic. At the same time, we still don't have enough information about where this investigation is and where it's going.
We're definitely in uncharted waters. Thanks to both of you, Bob Costa, Catherine Herridge. Appreciate you breaking it down for us. Our coverage will continue on CBS News streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nancy Cordes in Washington.
You have been watching a CBS News special report. A judge has unsealed the search warrant used on former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. We have learned from the warrant that FBI agents removed 11 sets of classified documents from Mar-a-Lago. Some of those documents were marked top secret. Some were marked secret. Some documents were placed in a secured government facility. The warrant is also saying that agents searched what's known as the 45 office used by former President Trump. This we've heard from experts throughout the afternoon today. That is extremely unusual. First of all, the warrant itself. And most importantly, we're learning that former President Trump, according to this warrant, is under investigation for violation or potential violation of the Espionage Act and potential obstruction of justice, which goes beyond the initial concerns or the initial potential charges of just the Presidential Records Act violation. I want to bring in retired FBI Special Agent Doug Coons, who joins us now. Doug, first of all, from your point of view, what does the release of these documents mean for the FBI? And of course, they're part of the investigation. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in my own reporting throughout my career, I reach out to the FBI and there is a boilerplate. It is under investigation. Now we have the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, coming out and saying, not only did I sign the warrant, which is not a traditional manner of a warrant being issued, that would be just up to a judge, but also that that the documents, that he asked for the documents to be released. How unusual is this, and what implications does this have for the rest of the FBI's investigation?
It is very unusual, and this whole thing is unusual. You know, this is unprecedented, an investigation at this level. And I think in the minds of the people that make these decisions, again, I'm speculating here, transparency being the key thing here. This is a very volatile situation, very polarized political atmosphere. So I think they're erring on the side of the utmost transparency, just so that people can see this is what led to it. This is what we're doing. This is what we found. So I think we're going to see some changes in the quote unquote playbook here this time, and instead of your typical no comment, which is what you would normally get from the FBI on an ongoing investigation.
I mean, this is not the first time that the FBI is dragged into, say, the political conversation regarding former President Trump, starting with the 2016 campaign. Does it seem to you that when it comes to former President Trump, the FBI or the Department of Justice has to act differently, because inevitably any leak or any release or any revealing of a current or an ongoing investigation will be inevitably politicized and debated in the media to a point that it impacts the very credibility or the name of the institution that is the Department of Justice or the FBI?
Right. I think on something like this, again, where there's such a charged atmosphere that everything has to be scrutinized at a higher level. Every I has to be dotted, every T crossed, and it's not a routine investigation that would have just required, you know, me as a street level agent going to my boss to get approval to take an affidavit over to the U.S. Attorney's Office to get their concurrence to then take to the judge. I mean, there's already a lot of checks and balances in the system for getting search warrants. And when you're at this level, it's just amplified multiple times because of this
I mean, I can't imagine.
I guess, yeah.
Just for you as an agent, I think there's a brotherhood, there's an institution that is the FBI that is essential for the upholding of our democracy. And FBI agents, not just as we saw, you know, in the past where it all started with James Comey back then, but now we're talking about agents who are going in to do their job every day, are being threatened, potentially targeted. I mean, what happened in Cincinnati is not something to ignore and is possibly tied to all of this. And seeing lawmakers calling for something like the abolishing of the FBI. What does this moment feel like for you? And looking forward to what's to come, how this is all going to unravel politically speaking, what's your sense?
It's all very disheartening to see my former colleagues who I'm still friends with. Some of them are also retired. I still talk to. Some of them are in my private investigation firm. They all kind of have the same attitude about this. It's scary. And they're being singled out for having some sort of an agenda. And, you know, I was there. It's not a political organization, despite what a lot of people think. We have a job to do. We investigate the crimes that we're assigned to investigate. We go where the facts lead us. And, you know, everybody's got their own political beliefs, but we keep our blinders on, you know, at least when I was there, and I'm sure they still do. and you just follow the facts and let the case speak for itself.
I mean, I think there's a misunderstanding that because, it is a federal agency, that it is because of federal level law enforcement that somehow the agency is in cahoots with the administration in place. And that has never been, well, perhaps not never, but that hasn't not been the modern history of the FBI.
Right, right. The president appoints the FBI director, and I was still an agent when Comey was relieved of his duties, which was a big shock to all of us. And that's really the first politicization that I had seen in my career. And now this current director, which was appointed by President Trump, again, he still has a job to do. It doesn't matter who appointed him. We have to investigate. The FBI has to investigate the crimes that come before it. And to do anything less would be a dereliction of their responsibilities.
I want to bring in a CBS News legal contributor now, bring her back in, Jessica Levinson. Jessica, I kind of want to recap because we have been just going through these documents. We've been going over the potential severe charges that former President Trump is being investigated for. Can you talk to me about just the potential gravity of these charges and what we can expect to happen in the next several days? Clearly, the Department of Justice acted swiftly to undermine whatever speculation, whatever disinformation could have was propagated between the time of the search and now. Now, when it comes to what we know that is in the search warrant, how swiftly can the Department of Justice, a grand jury be convened? Tell me what the next steps would be for the audience that is just joining us now after the special report.
Right. So for people who are just joining us, obviously what we're looking at now is the president of the United States, the former president, not only removing documents that he should not have removed from the White House, but removing documents that potentially indicate there's very serious national security concerns for him having those documents. We're talking about the Espionage Act. That's different from espionage, and we're talking about obstruction of justice, and then another statute dealing with him having documents that he shouldn't have. So far, it looks like the former president's defense is, I had the power to declassify those documents. I think there's two problems with that. One, it's not clear that the process for declassification was actually followed. The other is that based on some of these statutes, simply declassifying information does not solve the problem for the former president. You can have information to which you're entitled, but misuse that information, and that could still give rise to an Espionage Act violation, for instance. Now, you asked me what happens next. The answer is right now, I think what we're going to see is that there's a fight that's playing out, potentially a fight with media organizations who are saying, we want to see all of the documents. This is unprecedented. Right. There's a high public interest in this case. And so what we need here is not just the search warrant, which you and I are talking about today, but we need the affidavit, which we've been discussing, which is the one that will have the actual, a lot more information. Now, that affidavit could threaten the ongoing investigation and it could raise national security concerns. So I'm not sure we're going to see that. But short term, that's, I think, the fight that's going to play out. Longer term, can you convene and or continue the work of a grand jury quickly? You absolutely can. I will say we still don't know what's in the documents they found, and we would need to know that really to know what happens next in the investigation.
Doug Coons and Jessica Levinson, there's so many more questions that will need to be answered. And Jessica, you were talking about national security. Certainly the eyes of the world are on the United States, on our former president, on our governance, and hopefully this does not undermine the strength of the nation. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be right back with more.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready? A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it. We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
It's estimated that more than 2 million people in the U.S. are living with hepatitis C.
That's right. New government data shows many patients are not getting treatment for the deadly but curable infection. CBS News' Michael George reports.
It's been nearly a decade since breakthrough treatment for hepatitis C became available in the United States. Now, a new report from the CDC shows less than 1 in 3 people